All right. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to be taking you through a tutorial on the major themes in the poems of Petrarch. By the time that you are looking at this presentation, you should have already read that introduction in the Norton Anthology, pages 1480 to 1482, which will give you some background on Petrarch's themes, a little bit on his life, and his obsession with this lady named Laura, who represents the unobtainable for Petrarch, which became pretty much, we might say, the entire MO of his body of work, was trying to come to terms with that conflict. And exactly why was that a conflict? That is something that we need to address today. So if we look at, I'm going to direct you to this handout that I had created some time ago. And this is pertaining directly to those 6 or 7 selections that you have in Norton. So the first one that we're going to look at is the first poem that is presented to us, which is also titled number 1 in Petrarch's work, The Rime Sparsa. And I said, here he looks back on his long, unrequited love affair with Laura. What is he saying about himself in the poem? What is he saying about the nature of love and the battle between physical love and spiritual purity? All right, so that is something that we want to think about with this poem. So let's look at the first stanza, and you'll have to follow along in your Norton text for this. But he says, "You who hear in scattered rhymes the sound of those sighs with which I nourished my heart during my first youthful era, when I was in part another man from what I am now." So this is an older narrator who is looking back on his younger self. He's looking back on, what are some of those foolish mistakes that I made in my youth that I regret now? Those of us, when we get to a certain age, and some of you may already be there now, you look back on your younger self, right? And some of the choices and impulses that you had back then, and realizing that you didn't always make the smartest decisions, right? Especially about relationships and things like that, which is really where Petrarch is going with this. In the third stanza there, he says, "But now I see well how for a long time I was the talk of the crowd, for which often I am ashamed of myself within." So this is a recognition on the part of Petrarch that he has made quite a public spectacle of himself for love of this woman. He's even made quite a fool of himself at times. And he will come to regret that at various times in his life. Now, one of the things you'll discover pretty quickly about Petrarch when you read through his body of work is there's not a lot of continuity there. There's not a lot of consistency about his feelings for Laura, because he is conflicted. He's torn between his religious beliefs and his love for a woman, and he can't quite reconcile those in his mind, right? Because his religion has taught him that lust of the flesh is wrong. He feels a lot of guilt that's compounded about how he met Laura, which was, as he tells us, during a church service, right? So he's always torn between, was this a blessing from God, or was this the work of the devil tempting him away from God? And again, we'll see him throughout his life trying to reconcile that with varying degrees of success. And sometimes he seems to come to terms with that, and he accepts that his love for Laura is something that God intended, and then sometimes he's beating himself up over it because he feels like he strayed off the path that he was supposed to have been on. But when we look at Sonnet 1, we definitely see him, trying to come to terms with that. And then the next selection that you have in your text is Sonnet 3. What is significant about when and how he met Laura? How does this impact his feelings for her? Well, and you have the illustration there that shows him almost, according to this depiction, kneeling at the altar of Laura. She has supplanted God and the Virgin Mary in his consciousness. That's what this illustration represents. But again, as we know, he feels a lot of guilt about that. So in poem 3, he says, "It was the day when the sun's rays turned pale with grief for his maker, when I was taken, and I did not defend myself against it, for your lovely eyes, lady, bound me. It did not seem to me a time for being on guard against love's blows. Therefore I went confident and without fear. And so my misfortunes began in the midst of the universal woe." Now, the universal woe is actually referring to the crucifixion of Christ, because this was a ceremony that he was attending to mark the day of the crucifixion. It was a Good Friday, in other words. And this is where he meets her and becomes smitten with her and develops this lifelong obsession / infatuation with her. So again, this is another one of those poems where we see him, just really struggling and working to come to terms with that. Which, again, not to sound like a broken record, but that's really what you're going to hear in, 9 out of every 10 poems that Petrarch ever wrote, is coming back to this universal conflict about this relationship. Sonnet 34. This one, or actually let me clarify that. I know it says Sonnet 34 here. This one is not actually presented in sonnet form. We'll just say poem 34 to correct that. But this one is a little more difficult to understand without some background knowledge of Greek mythology. And of course, Petrarch was very well versed in Greek mythology. Here, he is using as an allusion here the story of the sun god Apollo and his obsession with a fairy named Daphne. And the story goes that Apollo was very much, I won't say in love with Daphne. It was more like an obsession. It was a lust thing. He wanted to capture Daphne. And of course, now we know where Petrarch is going with this, right? He's equating his love of Laura to this situation. Apollo tries very hard to capture Daphne, but is never able to because she will never be still. And he continues to pursue her, but he cannot catch her no matter what he does. So finally, now, the stories vary about exactly how this happens. But the most common version of this story is that Apollo Apollo wishes for her to be still long enough to capture her. The gods answer that prayer, but not in the way that Apollo intended. She's turned into a laurel tree. So Apollo at this point is very, the old saying, be careful what you wish for, you might get it. He wasn't specific enough in his request. So the gods have answered his prayer, but not in the way that he intended. She's been turned into a tree. What can he do with that? Yeah, he can touch the tree, he can hug the tree, he can, he can go and sit under it, but he doesn't have Daphne in the way that he wanted to, right? He wanted to have her as a wife, as a companion, as a mother to his children. That's not going to happen now. Does he have Daphne or does he not at this point? It begs a huge philosophical question. That's what Petrarch is relating to here. So he has chased Laura in the same way that Apollo has chased Daphne. He has never been able to capture her, except through his art, through his poems. So just like in the situation with Apollo, he's created a situation where he has her, but he doesn't have her. He's immortalized her, and she will always be there for him in his body of work. But it's not the same thing as having had a life with her, which is what he really wanted. So when he gets to that last stanza, he says, and he's addressing Apollo here, thus we shall then together see a marvel, Our Lady sitting on the grass and with her arms making a shade for herself. And of course, again, that big question that it's begging there, is this victory or is this kind of a defeat of his dreams of this relationship? And again, equating that symbol of Daphne as the laurel tree to what he has accomplished with Laura, which in a sense has been to consecrate her in the same way, that she's become this inanimate thing, this object of his art, but nothing more. All right, I'm going to pause in the recording right here because I'm just about at my time limit. So I'm going to pick up the rest of this presentation in the second video.